The illegal mining operation that cost David his life represented a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond simple mineral theft. Federal investigations revealed that Webb and Chen's activities were connected to larger criminal networks involved in drug smuggling and illegal resource extraction on federal lands throughout the southwestern United States. David's evidence provided law enforcement agencies with crucial leads that ultimately resulted in the dismantling of several other illegal operations on federal lands. The closure of David's case had broader implications for search and rescue procedures in wilderness areas across the national park system. His disappearance had demonstrated how sophisticated criminal operations could remain hidden, even in areas subject to intensive search efforts, leading to changes in how investigators approached missing person cases in remote locations. The National Park Service implemented new protocols requiring expanded searches of abandoned mining sites and other historical industrial areas when hikers disappeared in regions with known mining history. David's case proved that criminal activity could explain disappearances that might otherwise be attributed to wilderness accidents, leading to more comprehensive investigations that considered both natural hazards and human threats. Dr. Chen established the David Thornton Memorial Scholarship Fund, which provided financial support for graduate students pursuing research in environmental geology and wilderness safety. The scholarship specifically encouraged projects that combined scientific research with practical applications for protecting natural environments from illegal exploitation. Over the years, recipients of the scholarship contributed to research that helped law enforcement agencies identify and prosecute criminals operating on federal lands. Sarah Martinez eventually became an advocate for families of missing persons, using her experience with David's case to help other families navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of prolonged uncertainty about loved ones' fates. Her work with search and rescue organizations emphasized the importance of maintaining hope, while also preparing for difficult truths that might eventually emerge. David's story shows us that sometimes the people we lose continue fighting for justice even after they're gone, Sarah explained during a presentation to a wilderness safety conference in 2005. His determination to document what was happening to him, even when he knew it might cost his life, ultimately ensured that the truth would be discovered and that his killers would face consequences. That's the kind of person David was, someone who never gave up on doing what was right. The Grand Canyon site where David's camera case was discovered became an unofficial memorial visited by geology students, search and rescue personnel, and others inspired by his story. The National Park Service installed a discreet plaque recognizing David's contributions to geological research and acknowledging the courage he demonstrated during his final days. Marcus Webb died in federal prison in 2008, never having revealed the location of David's remains despite numerous attempts by investigators to persuade him to provide closure for David's family. His death meant that some details about the illegal mining operation and David's captivity would never be fully understood, but the evidence David had created provided sufficient information to understand the essential facts of what had occurred. Robert Chen, Webb's partner, was never located despite extensive efforts by federal law enforcement agencies. Intelligence suggested that he had died in Mexico during the early 1990s, but this information was never confirmed. The case remained technically open, pending any future developments that might provide additional information about his whereabouts or fate. The sealed mine where David was held captive became a crime scene that provided investigators with valuable intelligence about illegal mining techniques and criminal organization methods. The facility's sophisticated infrastructure revealed the extent of planning and investment that characterized criminal operations on federal lands, helping law enforcement agencies understand how to identify and investigate similar activities. David's geological research, interrupted by his kidnapping and murder, was eventually completed by other graduate students working under Dr. Chen's supervision. The findings confirmed David's preliminary observations about unusual erosion patterns in the Grand Canyon, leading to new understanding about how mineral composition affects geological formation processes. His research contributed to improved models for predicting environmental impacts of both natural processes and human activities in desert environments. The Thornton Transitional Zone, named in David's honor, became an important site for geological education and research. Field trips to the area included discussions of David's research methods and his contributions to understanding canyon formation processes. Students learned about the scientific principles David had been investigating, while also understanding the personal courage he had demonstrated in pursuing truth under dangerous circumstances. The 35mm camera that preserved David's final testimony was eventually donated to the National Park Service for use in educational programs about wilderness safety and criminal investigation techniques. The camera served as a tangible reminder of how modern technology could be used to create evidence that would survive environmental extremes and eventually contribute to solving crimes. David's field notebooks, preserved as evidence and later released to his family, provided insight into the scientific mind confronting extreme circumstances. His methodical approach to observation and documentation continued even under life-threatening stress, demonstrating the depth of his commitment to scientific principles and accurate record-keeping. The investigation techniques developed during the David Thornton case influenced how federal law enforcement agencies approached missing person cases in wilderness areas. The systematic search of abandoned industrial sites, the use of geological expertise in criminal investigations, and the careful analysis of environmental evidence became standard procedures for cases involving disappearances in areas with mining history. David's story became a case study in criminal justice programs, illustrating how victims could contribute to their own justice through careful documentation and evidence preservation. His example inspired law enforcement training programs that emphasized the importance of protecting and analyzing physical evidence that might initially seem unimportant or unrelated to criminal activity. The courage David demonstrated in continuing to document his captivity while facing mortal danger represented the highest ideals of both scientific integrity and human resilience. His determination that the truth would eventually be revealed, regardless of his personal survival, ensured that his death would not prevent justice from being served and that his killers would ultimately face accountability for their crimes. His legacy continues through the scholarship fund that bears his name, the geological research that builds upon his work, and the investigative techniques that were developed to solve his case. David Thornton's final week in the Grand Canyon demonstrated that even in the most desperate circumstances, dedication to truth and systematic documentation could create lasting impact that extends far beyond individual tragedy. The story of David Thornton serves as testament to the power of scientific training, personal courage, and moral commitment to overcome even the most challenging circumstances. His photographs and field notes, preserved against overwhelming odds, spoke across 14 years of silence to ensure that truth would ultimately prevail over criminal deception and that justice would be served for a young scientist whose only crime was pursuing knowledge in one of America's most magnificent wilderness areas. The October morning sun cast a golden glow across the south rim of the Grand Canyon. painting the ancient rock formations in shades of amber and crimson. David Thornton stood at the edge of Hermit's Rest, adjusting the straps of his well-worn hiking backpack one final time. At 24, he possessed the lean, weathered build of someone who had spent countless hours navigating Arizona's unforgiving wilderness. His sandy brown hair caught the early light as he double-checked his equipment list, a habit ingrained by 3 years of rigorous geological fieldwork under the demanding supervision of Dr. Robert Chen at Northern Arizona University. Sarah Martinez watched from beside David's rust-colored Ford pickup truck, her arms crossed against the morning chill. After 2 years of dating, she had grown accustomed to David's solo expeditions. But something about this particular trip unsettled her. Perhaps it was the way David had been poring over topographical maps for weeks, marking locations with an intensity that suggested this research meant more to him than his previous studies. Or maybe it was the conversation she had overheard between David and Dr. Chen, discussing some anomalous geological formations that didn't match existing theories about canyon erosion patterns. "You promise you'll stick to the established trails this time?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the weight of previous arguments about David's tendency to explore unmarked terrain. "I know you think you know every rock in this canyon, but—" David turned to face her, his green eyes bright with the enthusiasm that had first attracted her during their undergraduate geology courses. "Sarah, I've hiked the Hermit Trail dozens of times. This is just another research expedition, nothing more adventurous than usual." He gestured toward the carefully organized equipment in his pack: rock samples containers, pH testing strips, his prized 35mm Pentax camera with multiple lenses, and enough provisions for 5 days. Besides, Dr. Chen specifically requested documentation of the mineral deposits along the Tonto Trail. "This could be significant for my thesis defense next spring." Before we continue with David's mysterious journey, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us tell these compelling stories of mystery and human resilience. The morning air carried the distinctive scent of desert sage and juniper as David began his descent into the canyon. The Hermit Trail, originally constructed by prospector Louis Boucher in the 1890s, wound through layers of geological history spanning millions of years. Each switchback revealed new perspectives on the Kaibab limestone formations that crowned the canyon rim, the Coconino sandstone that recorded ancient desert dunes, and the deeper, older rocks that held secrets David hoped to unlock through his research. Sarah remained at the trailhead until David's figure disappeared around a bend marked by a towering pillar of red Supai sandstone. She had wanted to accompany him, as she had on several previous expeditions, but her teaching assistant responsibilities at the university required her presence for undergraduate lab sessions throughout the week. The compromise had been David's promise to maintain radio contact at designated check-in points and to return no later than Thursday evening, October 20th. David's research focused on what Dr. Chen had termed anomalous erosion patterns observed in aerial photographs of the canyon's eastern sections. Traditional geological models predicted certain types of weathering and mineral deposition based on the known composition of rock layers and historical climate data. However, recent surveys had identified areas where the actual erosion patterns diverged significantly from these predictions, suggesting either unknown mineral compositions or unexpected environmental factors affecting the canyon's development over geological time. The first day of David's expedition proceeded exactly according to plan. His field notebook, meticulously maintained in waterproof ink, recorded detailed observations about rock hardness, mineral crystal structures visible to the naked eye, and photographic documentation of particularly interesting formations. The Hermit Trail descended through multiple distinct ecological zones, each adapted to different elevations, moisture levels, and soil compositions. David's training had taught him to read these environmental indicators like a language, understanding how each element contributed to the canyon's complex geological story. By late afternoon, David had reached Indian Garden, the oasis-like area approximately 8 miles down the trail, where natural springs supported a surprising diversity of plant life in the otherwise arid environment. The Havasupai Indians had once farmed this area, taking advantage of the reliable water source and fertile soil deposited by flash floods over centuries. Now, the National Park Service maintained a ranger station, emergency shelter, and designated camping areas for hikers making multi-day journeys into the canyon's depths. Ranger Tom Blackwood, a weathered man in his 50s who had worked at the Grand Canyon for over 20 years, greeted David's arrival with the casual professionalism of someone accustomed to monitoring the safety of wilderness travelers. Blackwood's logbook recorded David's registration at 5:42 p.m., noting his stated intention to spend the night at Indian Garden before continuing deeper into the canyon the following morning. "Doing more rock hunting, I see," Blackwood commented, observing David's professional-grade camera equipment and geological sampling tools. "You geology students are some of our most prepared visitors. Always nice to see someone who understands how serious this environment can be." David spread his topographical map on the ranger station's wooden counter, pointing to the areas he planned to explore over the next several days. His route would take him west along the Tonto Trail toward Hermit Creek, then down to the Colorado River before returning via a more easterly path that would allow him to examine formations from multiple angles and lighting conditions. "I'm particularly interested in these areas where the mineral composition seems inconsistent with surrounding formations," David explained, indicating several locations marked with red ink on his map. "My advisor thinks there might be some unique geological processes occurring that haven't been properly documented yet. Could be significant for understanding how the canyon's development differed from our current models." Blackwood nodded approvingly. Despite his lack of formal geological training, 20 years of canyon experience had given him an intuitive understanding of the landscape's complexities. He had watched researchers make important discoveries in areas that seemed unremarkable to casual observers, and he respected David's systematic approach to his studies. That evening, David established his camp in the designated area near Indian Garden's main water source. His routine reflected years of wilderness experience, securing food against scavenging animals, properly hanging his equipment to prevent moisture damage, and positioning his tent to take advantage of natural windbreaks while maintaining easy access to the trail. He spent several hours after sunset updating his field notes by lamplight, comparing his day's observations with his preliminary research, and identifying specific questions he hoped to answer during the remainder of his expedition. The canyon's nighttime sounds provided a natural soundtrack to David's work. The distant call of great horned owls hunting in the darkness, the rustle of ringtail cats moving through the vegetation, and the constant whisper of wind moving through the rocky corridors that channeled air currents in patterns as ancient as the stone itself. These sounds had become familiar companions during David's previous solo expeditions, representing the vibrant ecosystem that existed within what many visitors perceived as a barren desert landscape. David's final entry in Ranger Blackwood's logbook, made at 8:47 p.m. on October 15th, indicated his planned route for the following day. A morning departure toward Hermit Creek via the Tonto Trail, with photographic documentation of specific geological formations Dr. Chen had identified in aerial surveys. His estimated return to Indian Garden was scheduled for late afternoon on October 16th, allowing him to establish a second night's camp before continuing his research toward the Colorado River. The morning of October 16th dawned clear and cold, with the promise of perfect hiking weather as temperatures would climb into the comfortable 70s by midday. David packed his gear efficiently, leaving non-essential items at his established campsite to reduce the weight of his day pack. His camera bag contained 4 rolls of professional film, carefully protected against temperature extremes and dust, along with the specialized lenses he would need to document mineral formations under varying lighting conditions. Ranger Blackwood observed David's departure at approximately 7:15 a.m., noting the young researcher's confidence and preparedness as he headed west along the well-maintained Tonto Trail. This would be the last confirmed sighting of David Thornton by any Park Service personnel, though Blackwood felt no particular concern at the time. David's experience and careful planning suggested a routine research expedition that would conclude without incident, adding another chapter to the growing body of geological knowledge about one of America's most studied natural landmarks. The Tonto Trail stretched ahead of David like a ribbon of packed earth winding through landscapes that had remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. His research would take him into areas where few people ventured, following paths originally created by wildlife and indigenous peoples long before the Grand Canyon became a destination for scientific study and tourism. Unknown to David, this familiar trail would lead him toward an encounter that would transform a routine geological expedition into one of the Grand Canyon's most enduring mysteries. The Tonto Trail meandered through a landscape that seemed frozen in geological time, following contour lines that traced the natural architecture of ancient seas and desert floors. David Thornton moved steadily westward from Indian Garden, his practiced eye constantly scanning the rock faces for the mineral formations that had drawn his attention in Dr. Chen's aerial photographs. The morning sun created dramatic contrasts between light and shadow, revealing details in the stone that would disappear once the day's heat began radiating from the canyon walls. Approximately 2 miles from Indian Garden, David encountered a section of exposed Bright Angel shale that displayed the unusual erosion patterns central to his research. The normal weathering process should have created relatively uniform horizontal striations following the rock's natural bedding planes. Instead, David observed irregular vertical channels that suggested water flow patterns inconsistent with known drainage systems in this area of the canyon. He spent nearly an hour photographing the formation from multiple angles, using different lenses to capture both the overall structure and detailed close-ups of specific mineral deposits. His field notebook filled with technical observations: vertical erosion channels 2-3 centimeter wide, depth varying 5 to 15 centimeter, oriented NNESSW, inconsistent with prevailing water flow patterns. Mineral staining suggests iron oxide concentration higher than typical for BA shale in this stratigraphic position. The work was methodical and absorbing, requiring the kind of focused attention that had always characterized David's approach to scientific investigation. He moved between observation points, like a photographer composing shots, seeking angles that would reveal the geological story written in stone over millions of years. This intense concentration meant that he paid less attention than usual to his surroundings, focusing on the immediate details of rock composition and mineral crystal structures rather than maintaining the broader environmental awareness that wilderness travel typically demanded. Around 10:30 a.m., David encountered a family of hikers from Phoenix making their way back toward Indian Garden. The Rodriguez family, Michael, Eleanor, and their 2 teenage children, had spent the previous night camping at Hermit Creek and were returning to the canyon rim via the same route David was following. Their brief conversation provided the last confirmed interaction between David and other visitors to the canyon. "That's some serious camera equipment," Michael Rodriguez observed, watching David secure his telephoto lens after photographing a section of Mauve limestone. "Are you documenting the trail conditions for the Park Service?" David smiled, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Geological research for my graduate thesis," he explained, gesturing toward the rock formation surrounding them. "I'm studying erosion patterns that don't match our existing models for how water shapes these particular rock types." Elena Rodriguez, a high school science teacher, showed immediate interest in David's work. Her questions about geological timescales and mineral identification sparked an impromptu educational discussion that lasted nearly 20 minutes. David's enthusiasm for his subject matter was evident as he explained how different rock layers recorded different environmental conditions from the canyon's ancient past. "It's like reading a history book written in stone," David told the Rodriguez children. "Each layer tells us about ancient oceans, desert environments, and climate changes that happened long before humans existed. The patterns I'm studying might help us understand how quickly geological processes can change landscapes." And the family continued toward Indian Garden, while David resumed his westward progress along the Tonto Trail. His next objective was a series of formations near Hermit Creek, where aerial photography had revealed mineral deposits that appeared inconsistent with the surrounding geological context. Dr. Chen's preliminary analysis suggested these deposits might represent evidence of previously unknown hydrothermal activity in the canyon's geological past. The trail gradually descended as it approached Hermit Creek, following switchbacks that provided increasingly dramatic views of the Colorado River far below. David paused frequently to photograph both his specific research subjects and the broader geological context that surrounded them. His training had taught him that understanding individual formations required comprehension of their relationship to the larger systems of erosion, deposition, and tectonic activity that had shaped the canyon over geological time. Near Hermit Creek, David discovered formations that exceeded even Dr. Chen's expectations for geological significance. A section of Vishnu schist, the dark basement rock that formed the canyon's deepest exposed layers, displayed mineral intrusions that suggested much more recent geological activity than conventional models predicted. The intrusions contained copper and iron compounds arranged in patterns that typically required thousands of years of specific chemical conditions to develop. David spent over 2 hours documenting these formations, using an entire roll of film to capture details that might prove crucial to understanding the canyon's geological development. His excitement was evident in his field notes. Significant Q-Fe mineral intrusions in VS orientation suggests hydrothermal activity much more recent than previously believed possible. Implications for canyon formation timeline potentially major. Must document thoroughly for Dr. Chen review. Off. The intensity of David's focus on his geological discoveries meant that he failed to notice subtle signs that his scientific activities were being observed. The remote location near Hermit Creek, rarely visited except by experienced hikers and backpackers, had seemed to offer the isolation necessary for careful scientific work. However, David's prolonged presence in the area, combined with his obvious use of expensive camera equipment and his systematic documentation of specific geological features, had attracted attention from individuals whose presence in the canyon was not sanctioned by legitimate research or recreation. Marcus Webb and Robert Chen, the latter sharing only a surname with David's academic advisor, had been operating an illegal mining operation in abandoned claims near Hermit Creek for several months. Their activities involved extracting copper and gold deposits from 19th-century mining sites, using modern equipment to process ore that original prospectors had been unable to extract profitably. The operation was small-scale but lucrative, taking advantage of improved metal prices and extraction techniques while avoiding the regulatory oversight that would accompany legal mining activities. Webb, a man in his 40s with extensive experience in both legitimate and illegal mining operations, had initially viewed David's presence as a potential threat to their activities. However, as he observed David's methodical documentation of geological formations, Webb began to see an opportunity. David's obvious expertise in geological assessment could be valuable in identifying the most promising areas for their extraction activities, potentially increasing their profits while reducing the time and equipment necessary to locate valuable deposits. The decision to approach David, rather than simply avoiding him until he moved on, reflected Webb's calculation that the potential benefits outweighed the risks. David's academic credentials and detailed knowledge of mineral formations could provide the kind of professional assessment that Webb and his partner lacked. Their plan was to convince David to assist their operation voluntarily, presenting their activities as legitimate research that would benefit from academic collaboration. Around 2:30 p.m., as David photographed a particularly striking section of copper-stained rock face, Webb and Chen emerged from concealment among the boulders near Hermit Creek. They approached openly, their manner friendly and professional, carrying equipment that suggested they were conducting legitimate scientific research in the area. "Excuse me," Webb called out as he approached David's position. "Are you with the University Geological Survey? We've been documenting some interesting mineral formations in this area and wondered if you might be able to help us understand what we're seeing." David looked up from his camera viewfinder, surprised to encounter other researchers in such a remote location, but pleased at the prospect of professional collaboration. Webb's partner carried what appeared to be legitimate geological sampling equipment, and both men spoke knowledgeably about mining history and mineral formations in the canyon area. "I'm David Thornton, graduate student at Northern Arizona University," David replied, extending his hand in greeting. "I'm documenting erosion patterns for my thesis research. What kind of formations have you been studying?" Webb introduced himself as Mark Williams, claiming to represent a private consulting firm contracted by environmental groups to document the impact of historical mining activities on canyon ecosystems. His partner, whom he introduced as Roy Collins, supposedly specialized in assessing the long-term environmental effects of 19th-century extraction activities. The deception was carefully constructed to appeal to David's academic interests while providing a plausible explanation for their presence and equipment. Webb had observed enough legitimate researchers over the years to understand the language and concerns that would resonate with someone in David's position. The environmental angle particularly appealed to David, whose studies had increasingly focused on understanding human impacts on natural geological processes. "We've located several sites where historical mining activities created unusual mineral concentrations," Webb explained, gesturing toward the area where their illegal operation was concealed. "The environmental assessment requires careful documentation of how these concentrations affect natural erosion patterns and water chemistry. Your expertise in geological processes could be invaluable in helping us understand what we're seeing." David's enthusiasm for collaborative research overcame his usual caution about deviating from planned routes and schedules. The opportunity to examine mineral formations from an environmental impact perspective aligned perfectly with his growing interest in applied geological research. Moreover, the chance to contribute to work that might influence environmental policy represented the kind of real-world application of academic research that David hoped to pursue in his career. "I'd be very interested in seeing what you've documented," David replied, beginning to secure his camera equipment for travel to the new location. Environmental impacts of historical mining are becoming a major research focus in our department. Dr. Chen, my advisor, has been encouraging students to look for opportunities to apply our geological knowledge to contemporary environmental challenges. As David packed his equipment and prepared to accompany Webb and Chen to their purported research site, he made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life in ways he could never have imagined. The geological discoveries that had excited him that morning would fade in significance compared to the human drama about to unfold in the hidden recesses of the Grand Canyon's ancient landscape. The journey to Webb and Chen's supposed research site led David away from the established Tonto Trail into terrain that required careful navigation across loose rock and around obstacles that had likely remained unchanged since the canyon's formation. Webb, who had clearly spent considerable time in this area, moved with the confidence of someone familiar with every potential hazard and stable foothold. His partner Chen followed silently, carrying equipment that David now recognized as more sophisticated than typical academic sampling tools. The site we want to show you is in a side canyon that most hikers never see, Webb explained as they climbed across a section of fractured Coconino sandstone. The mineral concentrations there are unlike anything in the standard geological literature about this area. We think the historical mining activities may have created some unique chemical conditions that are still affecting mineral formation today. David followed eagerly, his scientific curiosity overriding the wilderness safety protocols that normally governed his solo expeditions. Dr. Chen had often warned his students about the dangers of deviating from planned routes without proper communication, but the opportunity to examine previously undocumented geological formations seemed to justify the risk. David's confidence in his own wilderness skills, combined with the apparent expertise of his new companions, made the deviation seem like a reasonable research opportunity rather than a dangerous mistake. The side canyon they entered was a narrow defile barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast, with towering walls of red sandstone that created a cathedral-like environment. The geology was spectacular, displaying clear stratification from different geological periods and mineral staining that created natural artwork across the rock faces. David's trained eye immediately identified several formations that would have warranted detailed documentation under normal circumstances. "This is incredible," David said, pausing to examine a section where copper minerals had created brilliant green staining against the red background of iron-rich sandstone. "The mineral concentrations here are much higher than anything I've seen in the literature about this area. How did you locate this formation?" Webb smiled, pleased that his deception was proceeding smoothly. "Accident, really. We were following some old mining maps from the 1890s, looking for sites where we could assess long-term environmental impacts. This particular canyon isn't marked on any of the standard topographical maps, but the old miners clearly knew about it." As they moved deeper into the narrow canyon, David began to notice evidence of recent human activity that seemed inconsistent with environmental research. Tool marks on rock faces appeared fresh, and there were signs of excavation that went beyond the surface sampling that environmental assessment typically required. However, his companion's explanations seemed reasonable, and his excitement about the geological discoveries kept him from questioning their activities too carefully. The canyon terminated in a natural amphitheater where seasonal runoff had carved a circular depression surrounded by towering walls. Here David encountered the most striking geological formations he had ever seen outside of professional journals. Massive mineral deposits that appeared to represent millions of years of unique chemical processes, creating crystal structures and metal concentrations that defied conventional understanding of canyon geology. "My God," David whispered, setting down his camera bag to examine the formations more closely. "These deposits suggest hydrothermal activity on a scale that's not supposed to exist in this geological region. The implications for understanding the canyon's formation could be revolutionary." Webb and Chen exchanged glances, recognizing that David's expertise was confirming the value of the deposits they had been secretly extracting. However, they also realized that David's scientific knowledge posed a significant threat to their operation. A trained geologist could easily recognize the difference between natural mineral formations and the evidence of their extraction activities. "David," Webb said carefully, "before we proceed with the scientific documentation, there's something we need to discuss. Our environmental assessment project has some confidential aspects that require special handling." David looked up from the mineral formations, suddenly noticing aspects of his companion's behavior that his scientific excitement had previously obscured. Chen had positioned himself between David and the canyon entrance, while Webb's manner had subtly shifted from collegial enthusiasm to something more controlling and serious. "What kind of confidential aspects?" David asked, his wilderness instincts finally beginning to register the warning signs he had ignored in his eagerness to examine the geological formations. Webb's explanation of the confidential nature of their project quickly revealed the true nature of the situation David had unknowingly entered. Their environmental assessment was actually a cover story for an illegal mining operation that had been extracting valuable minerals from abandoned 19th-century claims. They had invested significant time and equipment in establishing the operation, and David's accidental discovery of their activities threatened to expose them to federal prosecution. "We need your help with the geological assessment," Webb explained, his friendly demeanor replaced by unmistakable menace. "Your expertise could be very valuable to our operation, and your cooperation would be much better for everyone involved than having to deal with the complications that would result from your reporting our activities to the Park Service." David's realization of his predicament was immediate and terrifying. He was alone in a remote location with armed men whose illegal activities would be seriously jeopardized by his knowledge of their operation. His wilderness experience included basic self-defense training, but he was outnumbered and far from any possible assistance. Moreover, his scientific equipment and detailed documentation of his planned route meant that his disappearance would eventually trigger a search, but not for several days. Chen produced a pistol from his equipment pack, making the threat to David's safety explicit, while Webb continued to present their demand for cooperation as a reasonable business arrangement. They needed David's geological expertise to identify the most valuable mineral deposits while minimizing the environmental evidence of their extraction activities. His cooperation would be rewarded, while resistance would result in consequences that Webb left carefully unspecified. "You're a smart guy, David," Webb continued. "You understand that we've invested too much in this operation to let it be compromised. But we're not unreasonable people. Your expertise is valuable to us, and we're prepared to compensate you fairly for your assistance. Think of it as a consulting opportunity that happens to require confidentiality." David's mind raced through his options, all of which seemed to lead to dangerous outcomes. Attempting to escape seemed impossible given the terrain and his companion's obvious familiarity with the area. Direct confrontation would be suicidal, given Chen's weapon and Webb's physical advantages. His only realistic option appeared to be cooperation, at least until he could identify an opportunity for escape, or until his absence triggered the search efforts that would eventually locate him. "What kind of geological assessment do you need?" David asked, attempting to project calm professionalism while his mind worked frantically to develop some strategy for survival. Webb smiled, recognizing David's capitulation as the beginning of a potentially profitable collaboration. However, his expression also carried undertones of threat that made clear the consequences of any attempt at deception or resistance. David's geological expertise would be valuable, but only as long as his cooperation remained complete and enthusiastic. The illegal mining operation that Webb and Chen had established represented months of planning and significant financial investment. They had carefully selected abandoned claims where their activities would be unlikely to attract official attention, using modern equipment to extract minerals that 19th-century technology had been unable to process profitably. Their operation was small enough to avoid satellite detection, but sophisticated enough to generate substantial profits from copper and gold deposits that earlier miners had left behind. David's forced participation in their activities would continue for the next week, during which time he would document geological formations while his captors extracted valuable minerals using his professional assessment to guide their efforts. However, David's scientific training and wilderness experience would also provide him with opportunities to create a record of his captivity that would eventually expose the truth about his disappearance. His camera, initially confiscated by his captors as a potential security threat, would be returned when they realized that photographic documentation could serve their purposes as well as his. The images David would create during his captivity would become crucial evidence in eventually understanding what had happened during his week-long disappearance, providing testimony that would speak from beyond his death about the events that had transformed a routine geological expedition into a desperate struggle for survival. The underground facility where David found himself imprisoned represented a sophisticated illegal mining operation that had been months in development. Webb and Chen had identified a network of abandoned 19th-century mine shafts that honeycombed the area near Hermit Creek, using modern survey equipment to map tunnels that had been sealed or forgotten for over a century. Their operation combined historical mining sites with contemporary extraction techniques, creating a hidden industrial complex in one of America's most protected wilderness areas. The main tunnel extended nearly 300 feet into the canyon wall, following a vein of copper and gold ore that original miners had abandoned when declining metal prices made extraction unprofitable. Webb and Chen had invested in specialized equipment for processing low-grade ore, using chemical extraction methods that could profitably recover metals from deposits that earlier technology couldn't handle. Their operation generated no visible surface disturbance and produced minimal waste, making detection by Park Service patrols virtually impossible. David's geological expertise proved immediately valuable to their operation, as his ability to read mineral formations and predict ore distribution helped them focus their extraction efforts on the most profitable areas. However, his cooperation came at the cost of his freedom, as Webb and Chen could not risk allowing someone with David's knowledge to return to the outside world with information about their activities. "Your job is simple," Webb explained as he showed David through the underground complex. "We need geological assessment of these formations to guide our extraction activities. Your expertise helps us work efficiently and minimize our environmental impact." Think of it as applied geology with immediate practical applications. The irony of being forced to apply his environmental geology training to assist an illegal mining operation was not lost on David. His research focused on understanding how human activities affected natural geological processes, and now he was being compelled to facilitate exactly the kind of environmental damage he had dedicated his career to documenting and preventing. The underground facility included sleeping areas, food storage and equipment workshops that suggested Webb and Chen had planned for an extended operation. Their investment in infrastructure indicated significant financial backing and long-term planning that went far beyond opportunistic mineral extraction. David realized that his accidental discovery of their operation had serious implications that extended beyond his immediate personal safety. Chen, who rarely spoke but maintained constant vigilance over David's activities, had military or law enforcement training that was evident in his approach to security and his handling of weapons. His presence suggested that Webb's operation had connections to more serious criminal enterprises than simple, illegal mining. David's captivity was managed with professional efficiency that implied experience in controlling unwilling participants. The work routine that Webb established for David combined geological assessment with constant supervision. Each morning, David would examine mineral formations and provide technical guidance about the most promising areas for extraction. His professional knowledge allowed Webb and Chen to work much more efficiently than their previous trial-and-error approach, significantly increasing their daily ore recovery while reducing the physical evidence of their activities. However, David's scientific training also provided him with opportunities to document his captivity in ways that his captors didn't fully understand. His geological field notebook, which Webb allowed him to maintain for recording technical information, became a carefully disguised record of his imprisonment. David developed a system of technical notation that recorded his location, his captor's activities, and his assessment of opportunities for escape or rescue. More significantly, David convinced Webb to allow him to continue using his camera for documenting geological formations, arguing that photographic evidence was essential for properly assessing ore distribution and extraction potential. Webb agreed, recognizing that David's photographic documentation could be valuable for their operation, while failing to understand how David might use the camera to create evidence of his captivity. David's strategy for using his camera involved careful manipulation of when and how he took photographs. While appearing to document geological formations for Webb's benefit, David actually created a comprehensive visual record of the illegal mining operation, the underground facility, and his captor's activities. He used his understanding of photographic composition to include details that would be meaningful to investigators while appearing innocuous to Webb and Chen. The film canisters became David's primary means of communication with the outside world. His careful labeling system, using geological terminology that would be meaningless to his captors, actually created a coded record of dates, locations, and circumstances of his captivity. Each roll of film became a chapter in the story of his imprisonment, with labels that would eventually guide investigators to the truth about his disappearance. David's most ingenious use of his scientific equipment involved his light meter, which Webb and Chen viewed as simply another piece of geological surveying equipment. David discovered that the light meter could be used to create coded messages by varying the readings he recorded for different locations. His measurement system created a numerical code that corresponded to letters, allowing him to embed written messages within apparently routine scientific data. The psychological pressure of his captivity was compounded by David's growing realization that Webb and Chen had no long-term plan for his release. Their discussions increasingly focused on the problems created by his knowledge of their operation, and David began to understand that his captors viewed his eventual death as the only reliable solution to the security threat he represented. However, David's geological expertise had also given him detailed knowledge of the underground complex that Webb and Chen had constructed. His understanding of structural geology allowed him to identify weaknesses in their facility and potential routes for escape that his captors, lacking professional geological training, had not recognized. The same skills that made him valuable to their mining operation also provided him with information crucial for survival. The abandoned mine workings that formed the foundation of Webb and Chen's operation were structurally unstable in ways that were invisible to casual observation, but obvious to someone with David's training in geological engineering. The combination of 19th-century excavation techniques and contemporary extraction activities had created conditions that could result in catastrophic tunnel collapse under certain circumstances. David began to develop an escape plan based on his understanding of the mine's structural vulnerabilities. However, implementing such a plan would require careful timing and considerable risk, as any attempt to sabotage the facility would likely result in immediate retaliation from his captors. David realized that his best chance for survival lay in creating evidence that would eventually expose the truth about his captivity, even if he did not survive to present that evidence personally. His photographic documentation became increasingly sophisticated as he learned to balance the need to appear cooperative with the necessity of creating a complete record of his captors' criminal activities. Each image served multiple purposes, satisfying Webb's demands for geological documentation while creating evidence that would eventually lead investigators to understand what had happened in the hidden chambers beneath the Grand Canyon. The most dangerous aspect of David's situation was his growing awareness that Webb and Chen's operation was temporary Unicode character. Their discussions revealed plans to complete their extraction activities and abandon the site within a matter of days, leaving no trace of their presence and no witnesses to their criminal activities. David realized that his time for creating evidence and planning escape was rapidly running out. As David's second week of captivity began, the psychological pressure of his situation intensified dramatically. Webb and Chen's conversations increasingly focused on their timeline for concluding operations and eliminating the security risks associated with their activities. David's geological expertise had proven valuable enough to extend his life beyond their original intentions, but he understood that this reprieve was temporary and that his captors were planning his death as a necessary component of their exit strategy. The illegal mining operation had extracted significant quantities of copper and gold ore during the months before David's capture, and Webb's discussions with outside contacts suggested that their accumulated profits justified the risks they had taken. However, David's forced participation in their activities had accelerated their extraction rate substantially, allowing them to recover minerals that might have taken additional months to locate and process without professional geological guidance. David's documentation efforts became increasingly desperate as he realized that time was running out. His photographic record now included dozens of images that comprehensively documented the illegal mining operation, the underground facility, and his captors' activities. However, he also understood that this evidence would be meaningless unless it could somehow reach investigators who would know how to interpret and act upon the information it contained. The challenge of preserving his photographic evidence while concealing its true significance from Webb and Chen required increasingly sophisticated deception. David developed techniques for creating apparently routine geological documentation that actually recorded crucial evidence about his captivity and his captors' criminal activities. His images included carefully composed shots that captured faces, equipment serial numbers, ore sample locations, and other details that would be invaluable to investigators. More dangerously, David began taking photographs that documented his physical condition and the deteriorating circumstances of his imprisonment. These images required careful timing and positioning to avoid detection, as Webb and Chen had become increasingly suspicious about David's continued enthusiasm for photographic documentation. David realized that these personal photographs might represent his final communication with the outside world. His field notebook became even more important as a covert communication device, as David developed increasingly sophisticated methods for embedding coded messages within routine geological observations. His technical notation system allowed him to record detailed information about his captors' plans, the location of their operation, and his assessment of the best approaches for law enforcement response. The notebook became a comprehensive intelligence briefing, disguised as scientific field notes. The most challenging aspect of David's evidence creation was his growing realization that he might not survive to explain the significance of what he had documented. This understanding led him to develop systems for making his photographic and written evidence self-explanatory, using clear visual symbols and written messages that investigators could interpret without his personal testimony. David's most direct communication attempts involved handwritten signs that he photographed himself holding, creating images that would unmistakably communicate his situation to anyone who discovered his film. These photographs required extreme caution, as they could not be explained as routine geological documentation if discovered by his captors. David created opportunities to take these pictures during moments when Webb and Chen were occupied with mining activities or equipment maintenance. His signs progressed from subtle requests for help to increasingly direct descriptions of his situation and location. The photographs showing David holding messages like "Help," "Being held," "Not accident," and "Follow water," "Cave system," "Not alone," represented desperate attempts to communicate crucial information about his captivity and the illegal operation that had destroyed his planned research expedition. The reference to following water represented David's geological understanding of the hydrology that connected the illegal mining operation to surface features that investigators might be able to identify. His training had taught him to read the subtle signs of underground water flow, and he realized that the mine's drainage system would create detectable environmental signatures that could guide searchers to the hidden facility. David's most sophisticated evidence preservation strategy involved hiding exposed film in locations where it would be protected from environmental damage while remaining accessible to systematic searchers. His geological training provided detailed understanding of how to identify stable microenvironments within the canyon's harsh climate, allowing him to cache photographic evidence in places where it could survive for years if necessary. The process of hiding his camera case in the crack, where it would eventually be discovered, represented David's most carefully calculated attempt to preserve evidence while protecting it from his captors. His understanding of rock formation processes allowed him to position the case in a location that appeared natural while being accessible to experienced climbers who might eventually search the area systematically. However, David's evidence preservation efforts also required him to continue appearing cooperative with Webb and Chen's operation while secretly documenting activities that could eventually lead to their prosecution. This psychological balancing act became increasingly difficult as his captors' discussions made clear that they were planning his death as a necessary component of their operational security. The deterioration of David's physical condition became evident in his later photographs, as the stress of captivity, inadequate nutrition, and constant fear took their toll on his health and appearance. These images provided disturbing testimony to the harsh conditions of his imprisonment, while also documenting the progression of time that would be crucial for investigators attempting to reconstruct the timeline of his captivity. David's final photographs revealed the desperate circumstances of his situation as Webb and Chen's operation entered its concluding phase. The images showed David's increasing distress and his realization that his time was running out, while also capturing crucial evidence about his captors' preparations for abandoning the site and eliminating witnesses to their activities. The message, "Sarah, love you, tell police gold mine," represented David's final attempt to communicate both personal and investigative information through his photographic documentation. The reference to gold mining provided investigators with a crucial clue about the nature of the illegal operation, while his message to Sarah ensured that his final communication included personal testimony about his feelings for her and his hope that his evidence would eventually reach the people who cared about him. David's scientific training had taught him to approach problems systematically and document observations comprehensively, skills that proved crucial for creating evidence that would eventually solve the mystery of his disappearance. His determination to continue his documentation efforts despite mortal danger reflected both his scientific commitment to truth and his personal determination that his death would not prevent justice from being served. The courage required for David to continue creating evidence while facing imminent death represented the same scientific integrity that had driven his geological research. His final photographs and written records became testament not only to his captivity and murder, but also to his refusal to abandon his commitment to truth-telling, even under the most extreme circumstances. The week of October 22, 1986, marked the conclusion of David Thornton's captivity and the final phase of the illegal mining operation that had claimed his life. Webb and Chen had accelerated their timeline for abandoning the site after receiving intelligence that David's prolonged absence had triggered expanded search efforts by Park Service personnel. The systematic searches were concentrating on areas increasingly close to their hidden operation, creating unacceptable risks for their continued activities. David's final field notebook entries, discovered years later by investigators, revealed his growing awareness that his captors were preparing for his execution. His geological observations became increasingly abbreviated, while his coded messages became more urgent and specific. The technical notation that had allowed him to embed crucial information within routine scientific records now carried desperate warnings about his imminent death and detailed instructions for locating evidence of the criminal operation. October 22nd, extraction rate, accelerating beyond structural safety margins. Webb discussing departure timeline with outside contacts. Chen cleaning weapons and destroying operational evidence, situation critical. Camera case, hidden at coordinates embedded in mineral sample data. Film contains comprehensive documentation of facility and criminal activities. Location markers in light meter readings correspond to emergency cache positions. David's systematic approach to evidence preservation reflected his understanding that his death was inevitable and that his only contribution to justice would be the documentation he had created during his captivity. His geological training provided him with the technical knowledge necessary to create evidence caches that would survive environmental exposure while remaining discoverable by professional searchers who understood his methodological approach. The confrontation that led to David's death occurred on the evening of October 23rd, when Webb and Chen discovered the extent of David's covert documentation activities. Chen had been examining David's camera equipment in preparation for destroying evidence when he discovered film canisters whose labeling system didn't match the geological documentation that Webb had expected David to create. According to Webb's later confession to federal authorities, Chen had realized that David's photographic work included images that comprehensively documented their illegal operation, their identities, and their criminal activities. The discovery that their captive had been systematically creating evidence against them triggered the violent confrontation that resulted in David's death. Chen went crazy when he figured out what David had been doing with that camera, Webb told FBI investigators. All those weeks we thought he was helping us document geology for the mining work, but he was actually building a case against us. Chen said we'd been stupid to trust him, that we should have killed him the first day instead of trying to use his expertise. The argument between Webb and Chen about how to handle David's betrayal represented the culmination of tensions that had been building throughout the period of his captivity. Webb had maintained hope that they could complete their operation and release David with warnings about the consequences of reporting their activities. Chen had consistently argued for eliminating David immediately, viewing his survival as an unacceptable security risk. David's murder occurred during this argument when Chen struck him with a mining tool in a moment of rage about the discovery of his evidence-gathering activities. Webb's account suggested that David's death was not premeditated in the sense of being planned for that specific moment, but was rather the inevitable conclusion of a captivity that Chen had always intended to end in murder. The disposal of David's body involved dropping it into a flooded section of the abandoned mine workings, where seasonal runoff had created underwater chambers that effectively concealed physical remains. Webb and Chen spent their final night at the site destroying equipment and eliminating traces of their operation, preparing to abandon the facility permanently and disappear into new identities they had prepared for this contingency. However, their hasty departure meant that they missed several pieces of evidence that David had carefully hidden throughout the underground complex. His light meter readings, embedded in technical data that appeared routine to his captors, actually provided precise coordinates for evidence caches located throughout the area. His systematic approach to documentation had created multiple redundant records that ensured investigators would eventually locate comprehensive evidence, even if some caches were discovered and destroyed. The 14-year interval between David's death and the discovery of his camera case reflected both the remote location of his evidence caches and the lack of systematic searching in areas that seemed geologically uninteresting to standard search and rescue operations. The narrow side canyon where Morrison and Chen discovered the camera case had never been included in official search grids because it appeared inaccessible to solo hikers using standard trails and equipment. David's calculation that experienced technical climbers would eventually explore the area proved correct, though the timeline extended far beyond his expectations. His understanding of human psychology and search patterns had led him to position evidence in locations that would eventually be discovered by the kind of systematic exploration that characterized professional climbing and geological survey activities. The preservation of photographic evidence over 14 years in the canyon's harsh environment represented a combination of David's scientific understanding of micro-environmental conditions and fortunate circumstances that protected the camera case from temperature extremes, moisture, and physical damage. His geological training had taught him to identify locations where natural protective conditions would maximize the survival prospects for delicate materials. The development of David's film by specialized laboratory technicians revealed not only comprehensive documentation of his captivity and the illegal mining operation, but also a chronological record of his psychological deterioration under the stress of imprisonment, and his growing realization that his death was inevitable. The photographs provided investigators with both criminal evidence and human testimony about the experience of being held captive by armed criminals in a remote wilderness location. The images that showed David holding handwritten messages represented his final attempts to communicate across the barrier of death with investigators who would eventually discover his evidence. His messages combined practical information about his location and captors with personal communications intended for family and friends who would eventually learn the truth about his disappearance. The resolution of David's case through Webb's confession and conviction brought both closure and renewed grief to family and friends who had spent 14 years wondering about his fate. Sarah Martinez, who had maintained hope for David's survival long after official search efforts concluded, described learning the truth about his captivity and murder as simultaneously devastating and relieving. Knowing what happened to David doesn't bring him back, but it does honor his memory, Sarah said during Webb's sentencing hearing. He never stopped being a scientist, even when he was facing death. He never stopped trying to document the truth and create evidence that would eventually lead to justice. That's exactly the kind of person David was. Someone who never gave up on doing the right thing, no matter how dangerous the situation became. Dr. Chen, David's academic advisor, emphasized the significance of David's evidence-gathering efforts as an example of scientific integrity under extreme circumstances. David's determination to continue documenting his observations, even when he knew it might cost him his life, represents the highest ideals of scientific research, Chen said. He understood that truth-telling was more important than personal safety, and he never abandoned his commitment to systematic observation and evidence preservation. The illegal mining operation that cost David his life represented a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond simple mineral theft. Federal investigations revealed that Webb and Chen's activities were connected to larger criminal networks involved in drug smuggling and illegal resource extraction on federal lands throughout the southwestern United States. David's evidence provided law enforcement agencies with crucial leads that ultimately resulted in the dismantling of several other illegal operations on federal lands. The closure of David's case had broader implications for search and rescue procedures in wilderness areas across the national park system. His disappearance had demonstrated how sophisticated criminal operations could remain hidden even in areas subject to intensive search efforts, leading to changes in how investigators approached missing person cases in remote locations. The National Park Service implemented new protocols requiring expanded searches of abandoned mining sites and other historical industrial areas when hikers disappeared in regions with known mining history. David's case proved that criminal activity could explain disappearances that might otherwise be attributed to wilderness accidents, leading to more comprehensive investigations that considered both natural hazards and human threats. Dr. Chen established the David Thornton Memorial Scholarship Fund, which provided financial support for graduate students pursuing research in environmental geology and wilderness safety. The scholarship specifically encouraged projects that combined scientific research with practical applications for protecting natural environments from illegal exploitation. Over the years, recipients of the scholarship contributed to research that helped law enforcement agencies identify and prosecute criminals operating on federal lands. Sarah Martinez eventually became an advocate for families of missing persons, using her experience with David's case to help other families navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of prolonged uncertainty about loved ones' fates. Her work with search and rescue organizations emphasized the importance of maintaining hope while also preparing for difficult truths that might eventually emerge. David's story shows us that sometimes the people we lose continue fighting for justice even after they're gone, Sarah explained during a presentation to a wilderness safety conference in 2005. His determination to document what was happening to him, even when he knew it might cost his life, ultimately ensured that the truth would be discovered and that his killers would face consequences. That's the kind of person David was. someone who never gave up on doing what was right. The Grand Canyon site where David's camera case was discovered became an unofficial memorial visited by geology students, search and rescue personnel, and others inspired by his story. The National Park Service installed a discreet plaque recognizing David's contributions to geological research and acknowledging the courage he demonstrated during his final days. Marcus Webb died in federal prison in 2008, never having revealed the location of David's remains, despite numerous attempts by investigators to persuade him to provide closure for David's family. His death meant that some details about the illegal mining operation and David's captivity would never be fully understood. But the evidence David had created provided sufficient information to understand the essential facts of what had occurred. Robert Chen, Webb's partner, was never located despite extensive efforts by federal law enforcement agencies. Intelligence suggested that he had died in Mexico during the early 1990s, but this information was never confirmed. The case remained technically open, pending any future developments that might provide additional information about his whereabouts or fate. The sealed mine, where David was held captive, became a crime scene that provided investigators with valuable intelligence about illegal mining techniques and criminal organization methods. The facility's sophisticated infrastructure revealed the extent of planning and investment that characterized criminal operations on federal lands, helping law enforcement agencies understand how to identify and investigate similar activities. David's geological research, interrupted by his kidnapping and murder, was eventually completed by other graduate students working under Dr. Chen's supervision. The findings confirmed David's preliminary observations about unusual erosion patterns in the Grand Canyon, leading to new understanding about how mineral composition affects geological formation processes. His research contributed to improved models for predicting environmental impacts of both natural processes and human activities in desert environments. The Thornton Transitional Zone, named in David's honor, became an important site for geological education and research. Field trips to the area included discussions of David's research methods and his contributions to understanding canyon formation processes. Students learned about the scientific principles David had been investigating, while also understanding the personal courage he had demonstrated in pursuing truth under dangerous circumstances. The 35mm camera that preserved David's final testimony was eventually donated to the National Park Service for use in educational programs about wilderness safety and criminal investigation techniques. The camera served as a tangible reminder of how modern technology could be used to create evidence that would survive environmental extremes and eventually contribute to solving crimes. David's field notebooks, preserved as evidence and later released to his family, provided insight into the scientific mind confronting extreme circumstances. His methodical approach to observation and documentation continued even under life-threatening stress, demonstrating the depth of his commitment to scientific principles and accurate record-keeping. The investigation techniques developed during the David Thornton case influenced how federal law enforcement agencies approached missing person cases in wilderness areas. The systematic search of abandoned industrial sites, the use of geological expertise in criminal investigations, and the careful analysis of environmental evidence became standard procedures for cases involving disappearances in areas with mining history. David's story became a case study in criminal justice programs, illustrating how victims could contribute to their own justice through careful documentation and evidence preservation. His example inspired law enforcement training programs that emphasized the importance of protecting and analyzing physical evidence that might initially seem unimportant or unrelated to criminal activity. The courage David demonstrated in continuing to document his captivity while facing mortal danger represented the highest ideals of both scientific integrity and human resilience. His determination that the truth would eventually be revealed, regardless of his personal survival, ensured that his death would not prevent justice from being served and that his killers would ultimately face accountability for their crimes. His legacy continues through the scholarship fund that bears his name, the geological research that builds upon his work, and the investigative techniques that were developed to solve his case. David Thornton's final week in the Grand Canyon demonstrated that even in the most desperate circumstances, dedication to truth and systematic documentation could create lasting impact that extends far beyond individual tragedy. The story of David Thornton serves as testament to the power of scientific training, personal courage, and moral commitment to overcome even the most challenging circumstances. His photographs and field notes, preserved against overwhelming odds, spoke across 14 years of silence to ensure that truth would ultimately prevail over criminal deception, and that justice would be served for a young scientist whose only crime was pursuing knowledge in one of America's most magnificent wilderness areas.